Hi, I'm Jonna Till Johnson. I'm the CEO of Nemertes. I'm here with my co-host, Greg Farrell, co-founder of Packet Pushers, and I'm here with Ned Bellavance and Kyler Middleton, who are the hosts of Day 2 Cloud. And they are guest hosts on this podcast for today. So welcome, Ned and Kyler.
Thank you.
Thank
So
you so much.
we wanted to go ahead and kick off all the stuff that Greg hates to hear, but we want to go ahead and kick off because you guys had a great question that you suggested we talk about, which is about failure. Everybody fails, but nobody talks about it. So you wanted to know, and we want to know, like, each of you tell us a little bit about a great failure you've had and how it's affected your career.
I studied, this is maybe a decade ago, for a CCIE, which is an expert level Cisco exam. If anyone's not familiar with the Cisco cert track, for 13 months for 20 hours a week. So it's like part-time job, full-time. I ignored my friends. I ignored my partner. I didn't have any hobbies for 13 months. And then I flew to San Jose and I paid $1,600 to sit in a locked room with someone who was yelling at me to focus up. And I failed. And I decided it was not worth it to continue for me. But I considered that a failure for a while, but I thought it through and my career took off after that. The skills that I acquired were just massive. Like it transformed my career. So I totally failed to get the certification, but I gained so many skills and the ability to focus and study, and that has catapulted me for the next decade. It's been a wonderful failure for me.
You know what I like about that is that I often tell people that my defining life skill is being too stupid to give up. So, right? And here you are proving my very, very point. I was too stupid to give up my CCIE studies, and I did eventually pass. But I always say to people, like, running a podcast company, for example, the smart thing to do would be to give up and go and do something normal that involves going and getting drunk on a Friday night or watching sports ball games on the weekend, whatever it is that other people do, right? If you were smart, that's what you do. And the flip side of this is a lot of people get bent up around certification as a goal. And the thing is that by the time you achieve the certification, by the time you pass the exam, by the time and this applies to many things in life, like university, by the time you're ready to pass the exam, you've achieved what you set out to achieve. The actual piece of paper or the validation has a different meaning. And what you're saying there is you studied for the CCIE, you learned a whole bunch of things along the way, and that's what's put your career in good stead.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. Consulting for many years. And I'm not stupid. I have been able to run circles around some of the engineers that I've met. Not all of them, but many. And that's been great. And this is a pitch I always give to junior engineers. Like, the seniors around you have failed so many times. Just, they did it before. You're not seeing it. They did it before. Now they seem brilliant and like they've never failed. But that's just because they failed a while ago.
Yeah. And an interesting point that I want to make is that you hear these people who went to Stanford and they like dropped out, right? All of those people who dropped out in like their third or fourth year when they learned all the skills and they met all the people they need to meet. And now they don't need that piece of paper because they already have the VC backing lined up. They've already got their cadre of people they're going to create their startup with. So they don't actually need the piece of paper anymore. And no, there's no stigma attached to dropping out. But when they say I dropped out of college and look how well it worked out for me, there's a lot of asterisks after that. So it's important to bear in mind that failure itself is not a great thing. It's the way in which you fail and what you learn from that failure that actually helps you succeed later.
I completely agree. And Ned, I'm curious what your greatest failure is. But before we get to that, I don't want to go too far down the path of, nobody needs a college degree. Nobody needs a certification. Arguably people don't need college degrees, but you do need to learn how to think about the hard stuff in a sustained way. And I haven't met too many people who will do that on their own.
Yeah, I mean, just on the college degree thing, there are still plenty of companies that require a college degree.
It's not about the companies requiring it. It's about the person learning to think and solve hard problems and solve problems that actually matter, that will matter to them downstream. Being able to understand what a second derivative is important. Being able to understand what an integral is important if you're trying to think about the world. And there are a handful of people who'll sit down and read a book and go, oh, that's really interesting. I've got it now. But most of us are like, oh, this is too hard. And you need the structure around you to learn this stuff. So
I just worry that people coming from very privileged positions can say stuff like, you don't need to go to college. And it's like, well, maybe you didn't need to go to college,
Right.
but me in the position background I come from, without that degree, I'm never going to get hired, even if I do have all the necessary skills for the job. So it's like important to balance those two things in
Same
your brain.
cognitive bias. And you could win the lottery just like me.
Exactly.
Exactly. Exactly.
So,
You could win the genetic lottery and have picked the right parents.
And the ones who quit college early are often Nepo babies. They've got money. Mommy and daddy paid for everything. And when they started their startup, they have money. So most often, not all, there are a few exceptions here, but there's often a lot of things going on. I want to take umbrage, perhaps, at something you said, Kylie, where you said all the people, all the seniors have failed. I don't fail. I think it's a mistake to treat failure casually. And I think many people say, oh, it's okay to fail because you can learn from your mistakes. That's actually an abrogation of responsibility. You have completely attempted to say it's not my fault and that the failure that happened is a learning opportunity for everybody involved. And there's a thin edge of violence and destruction that it's inherent in that statement. But there's also some truth in there. What is more often true is that seniors have done it before. And that will include successes and failures. And it will also include things like knowing the power of process or knowing what a review looks like or knowing what a young person who's an idiot looks like and knowing when to, or when they're doing them wrong. So I think there's the very invidious thing that's crept into tech, which is to try and make failure okay. And I think that should not be permitted to continue. It should respect the fact that failure is part of life, or is part of a technology career, but it should not accept that failure is the norm. And that's the distinction I wanted to make. Does that make sense?
It
Absolutely.
does, and I want to piggyback on that real quick because I think there's an important point here too. In tech, you can get appointed to be head of a company without ever having headed up a successful company, because there's this myth that having failed 5 times means you're going to succeed the 6th time. So you don't need any success in your life. So I would argue that failure is a good thing, can be a good thing. If it's a learning experience, it's still failure, but you had better have an equivalent number of successes at least in your career, because if all you've got to bring to the table is failure, then the idea that you're going to bring something great is a non-starter. And Kyler, I interrupted you, so over to you.
Well, I like that idea. I think that mindset of no matter what I do, whether I succeed or fail, I have learned, which means this is a success, makes you very resilient. And I don't know if it's factual, but it doesn't really matter, because me as a person, if I have that mindset, I'm going to continue. I'm going to have the courage and integrity and ability to move forward. And that's important.
I agree. And I want to hear from one of the guys. I noticed both of you have tap danced around Kyler's admission of failure without actually giving an admission of your own. And I've got one teed up, so I want to hear from you first.
I've got so many lined up. Where do we even start? Anyone's career progression is going to be dotted by failures, at least the really successful ones, because it's constant experimentation. Trying something, realizing you're not good at it, and then learning from that and accepting it. And my example is I did cloud consulting or general consulting for about 6 years, and I was kind of getting tired of it. It's a grueling thing to do. And so at that point, we were trying to build up the cloud practice. And so I accepted a promotion to become sort of like a product manager person for our cloud services portfolio. And I thought that I'd be really good at it because I understand what cloud services are. I've been delivering them for several years now. I have my MBA for what that's worth. And so I know a little bit about marketing and a little bit about 6 other things, So maybe I can build out this cloud services product portfolio and get in front of potential customers and start, selling or helping our salespeople make successful sales to do more services and less hardware. And I failed at it. I was not good at it. And it only took me about six or 7 months to realize that whatever the thing is that truly great product development and product managers have, I don't have that thing. I also didn't really have any good mentors, but in addition to that, I just didn't have the thing. I didn't have the spark that makes people good at that particular job. And I stopped. I quit my job there. And that's actually when I started working for myself. But the reason I started working for myself is because I realized that this was not a good fit. And I also didn't want to demote myself back down to being in delivery and doing consulting. So I had to find a third way out. And that third way out was working for myself and doing podcasts for some reason.
And here you are.
I'll pipe up with my failure. My failure is I feel like I am closer to the end of my career now than AI is before it reaches the market in any mainstream sort of a way. So it's probably like 5 to 10 years out, if you will, right? And I think in hindsight, I wish I hadn't failed my family. I put too much effort into my work and not enough into my family and not enough into I look back at the extra effort I put into work. And now I look back at it and think, those extra hours I worked, did I take a job away from somebody? Did I do work? Did I perform so well that somebody else missed out on a job? Did I take away somebody else's opportunity because of that? Should I have been at home with my daughters? I was home plenty. I'm not a bad dad particularly, but could I have done better? Possibly. Could I have spent more time with my wife? Could we have done more family things? I think that is the failure that stands out to me at this stage. Like, I'm a little older than you guys, and I look back and think, I wish I hadn't worked as hard, and I wish I hadn't have put in so much effort, because I may have taken away someone else's opportunity and someone else's opportunity to make money by putting in the extra hours. And I certainly took something away from my family because of that. So yeah, that is the failure possibly that's on my mind right now. Among others, there's lots of others. So don't get me wrong. I got loads.
I'm glad you said that, because for anyone listening, we know a fair amount about the folks that listen to this particular podcast, and a lot of folks are younger leaders who are thinking strategically. And that's a really good message to hear for those folks, because, I think, first of all, don't worry about the failures. As Kyler said, take your learning opportunity from them, figure out what you're good at and not good at, as Ned said, and then, Greg, as you're saying, if it's all about the career, you are probably failing somewhere else in your life, and maybe you want to reconsider that. Although, in all fairness, from our conversations, I know you actually were a good dad and are a good dad and are a good husband, but yeah. I get your point. Could you have been better?
I just think it's interesting to think about, like, companies call for us to make a sacrifice. Like, I'm big into the current dialogue which is going along, and the company in my life, we were expected to make a sacrifice for the company, but I cannot recall a time where the company sacrificed anything back for me. And that is another failure, right? Is to not recognize that asymmetry. And I wish I had been much more mercenary when I was young about saying, damn you, pay me. Right? Because if you want me to go and work the weekend, you should pay me extra. You should have paid me extra for that. And I should not have said yes. And if, and I look back on that and say, I wish, and I hadn't have done that for myself, but I also wish I hadn't have done that because other people might have been in the industry because of me, or I worked extra hours so that the company didn't have to hire someone else. Now that sounds good for the company, but it was actually bad for me. And it was actually bad for the person who missed out on a possible job. So it's not as simple, I feel bad about those things.
And I think it's also a role model issue, Greg, because there's a debate going on right now. California is trying to pass a law that makes it illegal to send text messages or emails after working hours. On the one hand, I think that's insane. That is a level of micromanagement that's nuts. On the other hand, I've talked through this problem with a lot of folks. And the issue is, if you're the boss, you want to send an email or a message when it occurs to you, and you want your team to be smart enough to realize they don't have to answer it right away. Well, yes, but no, because one person A may decide, okay, I'm going to answer that at 8:00 in the morning. Person B may be brown nosing and wanting to get ahead and will answer it immediately when the boss is sending it, get into an active discussion with the boss and get to shape the narrative before person A has even decided to respond, and that person will, unfortunately, get ahead. So you're creating an environment, whether you intend to or not, where it requires instant responsiveness and sacrificing every hour of every day to get ahead. So what I learned to do for that is I will schedule Slack messages and schedule emails because I don't want people to be getting into that toxic thing. But yeah, if you work weekends, if you're that person that responds to the email instantly overnight, it may be good for you, but it's also bad because you're playing into that toxic environment.
I think it's important to recognize that the grind is okay for a certain period of time in your life, and sometimes very necessary to get to the place you want to be in your career. I mean, for a period of time, I was doing consulting during the day and creating Pluralsight courses at night. And I did that for almost 3 years. And then I started working for myself. And I got to say, that gives you a very interesting perspective on what you're worth, how much you should ask to be paid. And if I ever went to go work for somebody else, I would take that same approach, Greg, you were talking about, the damn you pay me. If they want me to work extra nights and weekends, that's billable hours, baby. Like you're not getting that for free. But once I finally started working for myself, I found it difficult to turn that grind dial back down because I'd gotten used to working nights, working weekends on side hustles to try to grow that portion of things so I could work for myself. And then suddenly I didn't need to. My day job was doing that. And I found it difficult to not overfill my plate. And after almost 5 years, I've almost got it down. But,
so there's two failures here. Failure is, the first one is you let it happen.
Yeah.
For whatever reason. And the second failure is not realizing it and turning it off. Right. It's something that I struggle with and I've gotten better at, but I think it's still, I won't call it a failure because I'm aware of it and I'm working on it, but I haven't succeeded yet. Oh, now we're splitting hairs. Haven't succeeded.
Yeah, right. It's a not yet success. It's a pre-viable success. It is not yet a viable success.
So now we're down to it's a three-way switch: success, failure, and not either. In the middle.
Well,
right? I'm in a quantum state, if you will.
Right. I'm going to go ahead and toss in an actual failure because what you guys are talking about almost sounds a bit like what people say on interviews. What was your worst failure? Well, I didn't get the certification, but I became a kick-ass engineer. Well, I worked too hard. You know, those are all the things you say to your boss or their would-be boss, and they're like, "Ooh, these are good flaws to have." Mine was just a flat-out screw-up. I fired the wrong guy. And I was chief technology officer of a global consulting and engineering firm, and we were downsizing in preparation for going public because that's what you do. You basically take anything that costs money and get rid of it, if you can do without it so that your numbers all look good. And, as the CTO, although I didn't have direct reports, I had higher fire authority. Well, I did have direct reports, but I had higher fire authority over everybody in the company except senior leadership. So I can't even remember what the poor fellow's name was. I think it was Michael or something. I went to my team, which was the, top engineers in each of the different practices. So security, networking, applications. And I said, all right, who are the can't fire at all costs? Who are the only under extreme duress? And who are the, well, if you gotta, you gotta. And I got somebody from the can't fire at all costs list and fired him. And, he got the message, and basically I sat there and I got a call from my leader and he said, "You fired the wrong Michael." And I was like, oh. And then I put down the phone. I was back in the days of the phone. And I said to myself, I got two possible scenarios. Too bad, so sad, screwed up, move on, or try to fix it. And I finally went with, I got to try to fix this, because if I were that Michael, even if I never wanted to work for me again, I'd at least want to know that I didn't deserve to get fired. So I called the guy up, and I remember it was a Friday afternoon. And I said, "Michael, here's what happened. I am terribly sorry. I made this mistake. I want to let you know that even if you don't want to work for us anymore, I understand why you might not want to, but you are exactly the kind of engineer we want. We would love to have you. We would be honored to keep you on our team." And he listened and he responded okay. But then at the end, he said, "Jonna, can you do me a favor?" And I thought, yes, that's very thoughtful of him. He said, because he said it in a very measured way, he said, "Could you call me back again tomorrow morning? Because right now I'm really drunk and I'm not going to believe that you unfired me." And I did, and he did. And amazingly, he stayed with us for another 3 years and did great work. And I guess, I'm not sure what I learned from that other than maybe don't fire the wrong person. But also, I guess the big one was, if you make a mistake, just freaking own it and say, I made a mistake. Here's how it happened. Here's why it happened. It doesn't change it from being a mistake. And I do understand how you may not trust somebody who makes that kind of a mistake again. And strangely, it all worked out okay for him and for us. But yeah, I'm not sure. Honestly, that's a failure I'd rather not have made.
It's what you do after a failure that sort of defines how you look at it in retrospect. So you decided to make a decision to try to make it better as opposed to just kind of covering it up and not talking about it. And he ended up with a good job back, and you have an interesting story to tell.
Well, that actually is the best part. Honestly, there's, what's the old word about adventures? It's every disaster is a great story. So, so there's always that.
I think the key point from what you just said, Ned, is that how you handle failure is a key factor here. Mm-hmm. So if you handle failure well, it can be a success, right? So if you admit, I'm thinking of the time I accidentally rebooted the core switches in a massive network, accidentally. And I just stood up in the spot and said, I have made a mistake. And instantly picked up my laptop, turned to the CIO and said, I've just done this boo-boo. I am going down to do what I can to fix this immediately, and ran off, right? And of course, the world ended. There was, 2,000 people were sat around doing nothing because the core switches just went belly up, and everything came back, and the world did not end. As is always the case, everybody talks about uptime as if it's precious, but every time there's an outage, nobody dies, nothing ends. It's just whatever. Uptime's just normal, whatever. And I think it's the way you handle it. If you just stand up and take responsibility and act to fix it, is how you act in grace under pressure defines how bad your failure is going to be. I think not all of the time, but most of the time.
I think you're right. And actually telling that story reminds me that pretty much every one of the top engineers that I know has an exactly equivalent story, whether they, erased, one that I know of erased an entire disk drive and then had to recreate everything that was on it and learned about, I forget exactly what it was because it was a pretty interesting technology, but he basically learned how to recreate the ones and zeros from the physics and learned a hell of a lot more than anyone ever knew about it. And other folks have similar stories where they just wiped out something that just shouldn't have been wiped out and went back. Although I'll say my stories on those routes, I have a couple of them actually. But we did learn to take down all the servers on Friday afternoons at one company where I worked because it was just very simple and nobody could really trace it because we weren't running logs. So if you decided it was time to go to the pub or hang out and play a game in the sunshine, around about 2-3 o'clock, you just sort of fire off a kill command and you had your freedom. And so did everybody else.
I have this wonderful story about the opposite. This is a person this is not me, thankfully. This is an engineer who refused to admit that they had broken something. So they similarly had some drinks and stayed up late, and they thought they were working in their own Linux farm. And Yep. Broke some stuff and came in the next day to, a bunch of fires. Stuff was broken. And they had accidentally destroyed some Linux servers that handled VPN authentication. So we had a hard time even getting in to fix them. We eventually did, after a couple hours of downtime, all of the engineers sitting by, unable to get into our network. And we traced the logs, and all of the CLI history was erased. And it really smelled like a hack. It smelled like malware, because who would cover their tracks if they had good intentions? Mm-hmm. And we found the person who connected. I won't say their name because I'm worried that someone will track this story back. And we said, well, it looks like your user is the one that was in, did you do this? Like, did you make a mistake? Because that happens. I'm going to be like pissed off, but only for a little bit. And they said, absolutely not. This is definitely not me. And we were like, oh, well, that's actually way worse, because that means like your computer has been compromised. Somehow they figured out your 2FA on your phone. They hacked your phone too. That's crazy. And we spent 6 hours in like tier 1 InfoSec triage. There's malware riddling everything. And eventually he was like, you know what? I did do it. I should have said that earlier. And we were like, what are you doing? We have had the entire company on lockdown for hours. You just need to, it was Friday, and we were like, you need to just get out of here because everyone is mad at you. And we talked over the weekend, and we thought, like, because you let the company hang for 6 hours, we have lost faith in you. And to be an engineer, to sit in that position of authority and have those access rights to build and break stuff, that's a lot of authority on authorization. And we thought, you have lost our trust, and you have lost the ability for us to give you those keys, and you're done. And we fired that engineer. So owning your mistakes publicly is incredibly important a skill set.
And that's where failure is okay.
Yes.
Right? And that's where failure's like, everybody's made mistakes and failure is part of life. That's where that's where that line comes from. It's okay, or it should be okay. We shouldn't have to sit through blame storming and blame throwing sessions where, it's your fault, all that sort of stuff. We should just accept that. But where the failure process fails is when A, the person doesn't accept responsibility, or B, where it becomes personal, like, whatever. But otherwise, that is the example of when people should accept failure as normal, until you can't, of course. So that's where I think it comes in. That's that subtle differentiation between what we actually mean and what we actually do is two different things when it comes to failure.
Jonah, this is a question for you. What are your thoughts on how to handle failure from a strategic standpoint? This is heavy strategy after all. If you're in a management position and you want your engineers to feel like they can come to you when they screw up, how do you create a culture or an atmosphere that allows for failure without encouraging it?
Gosh, I didn't even know that softball question was coming, but I am so glad you asked, Ned. Because what we do and what I've always done in my organizations, particularly since the head of those organizations is the kind of person who has fired the wrong person, so made stupid mistakes. We use what I like to call NTSB rules. So it's National Transportation Safety Bureau, I think is what it's called. And essentially what they've done is they've set in place the rules where you can examine exactly what happened from the point of view of all parties. So, classic example, sailboat gets rammed by a cargo ship. Well, was it the sailboat's fault? Was it the cargo ship's fault? Was there insufficient lighting in the channel? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Or a case in point right now, they're looking at the Francis Scott Key Bridge in Baltimore. Was that, a failure of the cargo ship? Was it a failure of the bridge design, et cetera? And the point is, you need to be able to examine the facts without recriminations and without risk of major lawsuits. Oh, it was determined that you were at fault, and therefore we can sue your company out of existence, because nobody will be honest in that environment. So essentially, the rules are you have to be honest. You must be honest. Someone like Kyler, your engineer, forget it. They're out of there. You have broken the rules, not by failing, but by failing to be honest. But then you can't carry recrimination around either in, a concrete sense, like, oh, I'm not promoting you because you had that major screw up last year, or a subtle sense, shunning that person at meetings, treating them like they're less than because they made a mistake. You have to actually forgive, literally understand what happened, make the changes in the process, and forgive the mistake and move on. And I know forgiveness sounds weird in a corporate environment, but it's not something that's normal in a Fortune 500 company, but it is normal in the smaller organizations that I've been part of. Mm-hmm. So that's really, if you explain the whole NTSB rules, and you have to ask all the questions to find out really what happened. And so one of the things I push back on my team all the time on is I'm not okay with I made a mistake. You hit the wrong button. Why did you hit the wrong button? Were you distracted? Was the button in the wrong spot? Was the button the wrong color? Were you confused about what you were trying to do?
Did you not know what you were going to do? Did you
Exactly.
do something that you didn't know how to do and you failed to ask for help? Therefore, you need training.
Exactly. And because, there's a discipline called the 5 whys, which is about getting to the root cause of any problem. And Ned, you're nodding, so I know you must have heard of this, but it's exactly that. You hit the wrong button. Why did you hit the wrong button? Well, I was going after the green one, and the green one looked like it was the right one to hit. Okay, maybe that was a user interface thing. Why did you think the green one was the right one to hit, and so forth and so on? And it turns out it takes about 5 to get to the root cause of whatever went wrong. And the only thing that kills that process is, I don't know, I just screwed up. And I just screwed up is as unacceptable as I didn't screw up. You have to be willing to look at the root cause. You have to be willing to understand why you screwed up. And if you start applying that to yourself, well, I've gone on for a while, but there's one last story I want to tell because when ATMs first came out, it was a brand new snazzy thing. But what they had you do was it would take your card, hold your card until it gave you the money, and then spit out the card. Well, they had this epidemic of people leaving their cards in the machines because they put the card in, get the money, and forget that they left the card there. And so either you could say all these people are stupid and they made mistakes, or you redesign the system so it's not a stupid system and it gives you your card back first before you get your money. And once they figured that out and they gave the card back first, everything got a whole lot better. And that's why, if the answer had just been people are being stupid, oh, well, the system never would have improved.
There's a lot of nuance in there. So the 5 whys is an excellent guideline, but there's a lot of gap in between just ask why 5 times and the situation that you're in. And as somebody who's worked from small companies right the way up to very large companies, I particularly recall working in companies where I was the only one in my job, which is like the loneliest position, like to be the only networking person in a team of 20, 30, 40 people. And every decision you make is yours. You don't have anybody, everybody else around you's got, there's usually 2 or 3 server guys and there's a team of storage people and there was SQL people and, blah, blah, blah. And then down over here in the corner was me, just networking, doing the network. And the only person I had to ask was me. Right. And so that ability that's when I actually learned about rubber duck debugging, if you've ever heard of that.
No, I haven't actually.
Have you ever heard of rubber duck debugging?
I have not.
Awesome.
Yeah. It's I used to have a little rubber duck on my desk and I would sit there and talk to the rubber duck. And the philosophy is if you can talk to somebody, then quite often your brain will work out the problem. It's the very process of talking it out. And in technology lore, if you go and search for it, there are various things. There's something that goes back 30 years where they would go and there was a joke somewhere where you would talk to your rubber duck in the bath, and that was how you sorted out your life's problems. And at some point about 20 years ago, it became, excuse me, John, I need to do some rubber duck debugging. I need to talk through this with you. And you would talk to them. And then by the time you got to the end of your 10th sentence, you go like, thanks, John, I've solved it. You're great help. And he hasn't said a word, right?
Yep.
Rubber duck debugging. So, so that story is tangential to the 5 whys, but it is a thing like, the way you approach the 5 whys is contextual. It's in relationship to the company that you're in, to the size of the team, the criticality of the technology that you're on. Like when you're in a hospital, everybody says IT is critical, except they don't actually spend any money on it. So they lie, right? So asking the 5 whys is always going to end up in, oh, that's a 20-year-old thing and it's bound to break anyway, right? But if you're on the trading floor of a bank, 5 whys tend to come with 5 project managers, 15 senior executives, and lawyers most often sitting in the
yes,
and so there are the experience of the 5 whys can go anywhere from a reaming to a that was silly, wasn't it, sort of thing. So context is everything.
Well, and you do have to keep the reamings out as limited as possible. And sorry, Ned, I cut in.
Yeah. Well, no, I'm just thinking about the way that we address failures, whether it comes from a systemic problem or if we try to foist it on the individual, like you failed. But so many times it's not just that the individual failed, it's that the system around them also failed to give them the resources they require, the training they need, the mentoring that could have helped them be successful.
The vendor products being outright
the vendors are just stupid. Yeah.
Or insecure, like Microsoft, right? How many times does Microsoft have to be insecure before companies will stop assuming that Microsoft is secure? Like Microsoft
but
Azure
if you give them enough money,
the most insecure public cloud out there.
Absolutely. If you give them enough money, though, they'll fix the vulnerabilities that they put there. Yeah, it's just like extortion.
That's like Tesla. Oh, you want your car to actually have 200 miles of range? Oh, that costs extra.
You want your car to not explode? Oh, you're demanding.
I know we're getting on our soapbox here about Azure and Tesla, but to rein it back to the point I was trying to make is if you identify it as a systemic problem, the solution isn't on the individual to fix it. And sometimes that's the expectation is you screwed up. Now you need to fix it. Well, you have no control over the circumstances of the failure. So how can I put it on you to fix that problem? And that goes well beyond technology into just like general society, right? So I think, John, back to my question around how you build that culture. Part of building that culture is recognizing that the fault is often with the process or the system and not with the individual human, and being willing to then actually make the change to improve that system.
I would agree with that, but only partly, Ned, to be honest. That's why I keep coming back to NTSB rules, because people do make mistakes. Sure. Pilots do pilot their ships drunk. Sailboats do ignore warning lights or not know how to read them. And I think the main point is that, yes, there may be a process improvement. Yes, there may be a technology improvement. Yes, we could go kick Microsoft some more and that'll make us all feel better. But at the end of the day, we have to be open to the fact that any of these can fail. It can also be a poor decision on the part of a human being who should not have made a poor decision. And no amount of process is going to be perfect. It's like process and structure are created by humans. Humans are imperfect. Therefore, there is no process, no perfect process, and there never will be.
Right. If you make it idiot proof, they'll make a better idiot. That's
and honestly, sometimes you don't want to go too far making it idiot proof, because at some point you have to depend on people to do the right thing, regardless of what the process is, which means they need to internalize what the right thing is. And that's much more complicated than it sounds. It's something we actually do a lot of training on. There's a whole concept called mission command that has to do with why are you doing what you're doing, and whose mission is it, and whose mission is that in support of, and how do the missions join together? But that's a whole different discussion. But at some point, you have to be able to say the human should be able to take himself or herself out of the process and do the right thing if the process isn't working. And so my concern is I've seen it happen in organizations where people will just say, oh, yeah, I screwed up and the process was broken. Oh, sorry. And it's like, no.
There's one thing I want to jump in here. I would say that over 80% of failures that I've been a part of have actually been due to poor vendor products. They have not been human failure. They have not been failures of design or intent or implementation. They are simply faulty products. How many, firmwares, operating systems, how many configurations according to the manual have I done, and then something's gone wrong because the vendor has so poorly implemented or supported their product? And in my case, something like 80%. And it's part of the reason I'm so cynical and outspoken about it is that professionals who are, like us, will happily sit there and say, oh, it's a bug, it's my fault, which is wrong, right?
Right.
And we don't go back to the vendor and say, your product is faulty, I want a refund, right? Have you ever gone back to a technology vendor and gone, this laptop is faulty? Or gone back to Windows and said, Microsoft Windows has spontaneously rebooted 4 times. This product is faulty. I demand a refund or a rebate. Right? Why do we not? And because we don't, the vendors get a free ride to keep putting out poor quality products with very low levels of testing and quality assurance. What do you think, Ned?
I feel like we're accepting their failure and abdicating their responsibility.
Beyond that, we encourage it because we don't push back and say, we should be writing service contracts that say, for every bug I find, you should pay me 10% of the value of what I'm buying from you. That would not be unrealistic.
I'm going to push back on you there, Greg. I agree with most of what you said. But in the telecom space, I've negotiated tons and tons of contracts. And as we all know, in the telco space, there are credits for outages. So if you contracted with us to get your packets from point A to point B, and if our network goes down, we'll give you a credit. The problem is the credits are always predicated on if you're paying $5,000 a month, you pay $5,000 less dollars, but that has nothing to do with the value of that site that got disconnected. So when I go back to clients, I try to get them to forget the credits and put in a termination with no penalty clause in the case of either extreme failure, the whole network, the whole network goes down. Yeah. Or chronic failure, the network doesn't really go down, but it kind of hums at in a gray zone for a while. And we spend time crafting those clauses. But I will tell you, the vendors go purple when you go back to them and say, I want termination without penalty, because that hurts them. Yeah. That's millions of dollars they don't get. Yeah,
I have done that.
I have too.
I used it in a negotiation tactic. And I said, do you guarantee this product works? And they basically said no. I said, well, I want a 30% discount because it's going to cost me that to fix it. We got it in the end. Yep. Had to bring the lawyers in to go through that. I said, well, if you can't guarantee me it, I need something. If you bought a secondhand car, right? If you go to buy a car and there's 2 flat tires on it, you don't pay full price for it. You either expect it to be fixed or to get money off so that you can get the tires replaced, right? Why is that not true of technology vendors? It's that's failure.
Well, again, I will push back on that though, because it's not the cost of the car; it's the value of the business you would do with the car. That's the important distinction. Wow. But no, it's actually a very important distinction because it's a lot more.
But the question is, how are you going to get a viable outcome from a vendor who refuses to, when a supply contract says, we do not guarantee our products to work. We do not guarantee them to work on a sustained basis. We'll give you a hardware warranty for 90 days. After that, you have to pay us for any sort of hardware reliability after that gap. If you bought a car on that basis, 90 days guaranteed, hardware flaws only, no software, how would you feel?
Yeah, but you wouldn't.
In corporate IT, apparently, fine.
Well, and I think that gets back to the main point, which is failure can be humans, it can be process, it can be the technology. And I think sometimes it's very clear to know which is which before you take any further action. And that comes back to, Ned, your question about how do you create that culture. It helps to recognize that it can be equipment failure as well as process failure, as well as human error. And still you need to understand why and what you can do about it. But I think your point is we should not internalize it and assume it's all human.
It's how you respond to the failure that ultimately defines you and your organization. So if it is a vendor problem, how do you respond to that? And the answer can't be, well, we just deal with it. There has to be some level of pushback and culpability on the vendor for producing shoddy software, whether that's a refund or credits, or you just walk away and go with a different vendor that has a better, more proven solution, or build something in-house. I mean, Kyler, I know you're a huge proponent of open source, and that's one of the nice things about open source is if the thing that was produced is broken, you can take the code and make it work for you.
Absolutely. And totally customize it.
Or you know who broke it.
And if you broke it, that was probably you.
Yeah. Well, so I think we've managed to spend a full podcast episode on this, but I think it was time well spent because I don't think people usually like to talk about failure, their vendors, their organizations. We try to shove it under the covers and pretend that that we're all shiny, happy people. So yeah, as Ned just texted me, we all succeed at failure. So there's that. It's always that, which reminds me of one of my absolute famous jokes, about the Russian people who were famously cynical. The difference between a Russian optimist and a Russian pessimist. A Russian pessimist says, that things cannot possibly get any worse. A Russian optimist says, oh, yes, they can. So with that, thank you, Ned. Thank you, Kyler, for being here, for giving us a provocative topic. Where can folks find you if they want to hear more of your dulcet voices?
I guess they can find us at Day 2 Cloud. If you go to Packet Pushers and look for Day 2 Cloud, the podcast is available there. And then me personally, I blog and do other things at nedinthecloud.com, or you can ping me on LinkedIn.
And Kyler, what about you?
Same for me. Very active on LinkedIn, very active on Medium, and you can come listen to us on Day 2 Cloud.
And that's Kyler Middleton on LinkedIn.
Yep.
and Ned Bellavance on LinkedIn. And you can always join Greg and me at Heavy Strategy, which you know because you're already listening to it. If you want to get feedback or follow up for us on this topic or have ideas of your own, please send us a message at packetpushers.net/FU, which stands for follow up. Really, it does. But we would love to hear from you about your own experiences, your own failures, your own successes, what you think works and doesn't work about the show. We read every message. You do not have to leave your name, number. You can be completely anonymous, but we do read every message and discuss the fun ones. Anyway, there's a whole lot more on the Packet Pushers site, so check it out. You can also come check me out on the Nemerdes.com site. There's a button you can push for contact us, and I will get back to you. And Greg, is anywhere else you want to ask folks to find you?
You can find me on Twitter. I might be the last surviving technologist who's still putting out content on Twitter. I am sort of trawling around on LinkedIn, but I find it very difficult for some reason. It doesn't really show me anything useful. There's only so much AI resume rubbish I can withstand, so there's only a limited amount of time I can spend on LinkedIn before I give up in emotional distress. But come and find me. And of course, you can find me on Heavy Strategy, but also on the Network Break podcast, which is on the Packet Pushers Network.
Great. Thanks, everyone.